Hello, my name is Jeffrey Nicholas. I'm a professor of philosophy at Providence College. This is the third lecture in a four-part lecture series on Catholic social thought, centered around the document Rerum Novarum. Rerum Novarum begins, "The spirit of revolutionary change, which has long disturbed the nations of the world, has passed from politics to economic life." And the first two parts of this series has situated this document within the changes within economic and political life from the great synthesis of the Catholic intellectual tradition with Thomas Aquinas in the 1200s and Dante in the 1300s. So part one was the events from that time period forward, and part two considered the theoretical changes. This part, we will look specifically at the document, Rerum Novarum, and then in the final part, we will look at the legacy of Rerum Novarum. Now, we ended our last lecture talking about Pope Pius IX, and particularly the syllabus of errors and the doctrine of papal infallibility. This was a closing off of the Roman Catholic Church to modernity in both of these moves, and Pius IX has this honor of picturing for or being the metaphor for us of the Catholic Church's responses to modernity from the 1400s to the late 1800s. But it also lays the groundwork for his successor, Leo XIII. Leo lived from 1810 to 1903 and was Pope from 1878 to 1903. And we can often think about Leo coming into the Vatican and opening the windows and letting in fresh air. So there's a great change in attitude, at least, not necessarily in doctrine or idea, but in attitude towards the modern world. So he returns to this idea that science and religion can coexist, something that has been a struggle during the modern period and related to that idea of the twofold truth that we talked about in Lecture 2, and something that remains a struggle, as of course people today argue over science and religion in terms of evolution and other issues. Another thing that Leo XIII did was open up the Vatican's secret archives and allowed outside scholars in to examine these archives and to study in them. One of the more interesting things is that he founds the Vatican Observatory to look into the skies, and he says, so that everyone might see clearly that the Church and her pastors are not opposed to true and solid science, whether human or divine, but that they embrace it, encourage it, and promote it with the fullest possible devotion. Now, of course, the emphasis here will be on true and solid science, and that will be important for keeping that idea in mind when we talk about science in the Church after this period. He also opens up the Vatican to sound recording and film recording. Of course, these are relatively new themselves, but he embraces these modern technologies and brings them into the Church to help keep the Church up with modern times. Now, of course, we're looking at the publication of Rerum Novarum, which occurred in 1891, and this is the first document of what we call the Catholic social thought tradition. Now, when we say it's the first document of the Catholic social thought tradition, we're not saying that there's something new here. What we are saying is that it is a engagement with the modern world that had been missing since the 1300s, right? And the doctrines that are here are a recasting of the sort of natural law theory that we would have found in someone like Thomas Aquinas in the 1300s, but now applied to the modern day. And the reason for this, of course, is because of the revolutionary changes that we talked about in Lecture 1 and Lecture 2, and particularly the changes in practical economics. So encyclicals are not new in the church, but here we have these encyclicals addressing economics and the economic question in a new way in the modern times, particularly reflecting on capitalism and socialism. Of course, this is always cast in the light of a moral question. And so Leo XIII says that there is a prevailing moral degeneracy in the modern world that the church has to stand against. Okay. And so it's going to take wise people to make tough decisions. And he recognizes that this divide between capitalism and socialism has taken hold of the world in a way that no other question has. Now, the document itself is outlined in 8 parts. The outline is here. We are not going to cover all of these parts. We're going to focus on just a few of the themes, but you can certainly find this document online for free and study it yourself. There are other books on the document. One of the primary books for Catholic social thought that I would recommend is Donald Doerr's The Option for the Poor. And certainly everything that I know about Catholic social thought begins with Doerr's book. Now, I mentioned that what Leo XIII is trying to do is respond to the rise of capitalism and socialism. And he establishes what we can call the middle way between these two great economic theories. And this middle way has defined Catholic social thought up until the time of John Paul II in the late 1980s. And then when the Soviet Union fell, there was a turn of Catholic social thought towards an acceptance of capitalism that only came into question with the elevation of Pope Francis. So that is something to keep an eye on for the future. We are not going to talk about that in this lecture series. But the idea for us that begins with Catholic social thought is this middle way. And so there's a challenge to capitalism from Catholic teaching that the rich have duties to their workers, which including respecting the dignity of the workers and giving them gainful occupations that are not shameful. Again, we'll talk about that involves the morality that Pope Leo XIII is concerned with there. That also gives them time for spiritual well-being, so time for prayer and time to be free from corruption, not to overimpose work, and to, of course, give proper pay. Now, there is, in some sense, not necessarily a condemnation of capitalism, but a condemnation of the way capitalism is operated. With socialism, there's much more of a rejection of socialism with most of papal encyclicals. And part of this comes with the recognition that socialism provides one answer to the unjust system. But in doing so, it gets rid of property. And so Leo XIII and all of Catholic social thought is going to defend the right to property, just as St. Thomas Aquinas did. Of course, to understand that, you have to understand what this right to property is based on, right? And so we have to understand that God gave the earth to all to enjoy, and property becomes something that's necessary for the head of the family in order to provide for the family. So the family has a right to property. And certainly what Leo XIII is doing here is calling back to the medieval period, to the feudal times, when every family had a piece of property so that they could feed themselves. And this property was done away with by capitalism. So there is a challenge to capitalist notions of property here. And that challenge is rooted into the idea that every family has a right to property enough to take care for themselves. Property also provides an incentive for ingenuity, and socialism denies this. So again, a more of an acceptance of capitalism and a rejection of socialism, but there's always this critique of capitalism there. Okay, so the right of property is a right based on the family and the person, not necessarily on the corporation, as we would see under classical liberalism. Now, workers also have rights and duties as well. So work is implemented in nature and belongs to the worker, and work is necessary to preserve human life. So we have this duty for work, but that duty has to be repaid with just wages. And so there is this emphasis again in this middle way between saying that capitalists have rights, but they also have duties, and workers have rights and they have duties. And so there's an attempt to bring them together. One of the interesting things is that Leo XIII will defend the right to unions, although he does not defend to right the strike. Now, this is an interesting challenge for most Catholic institutions today, which do not allow unions. So there's some conflict there in the institutions of the Catholic Church versus the theory of the Catholic Church. But Catholic social thought, which is part of canon law, insists on the right of workers to unions. In our discussion of the history leading up to Rerum Novarum, we saw that there was conflict between church and state, and this was over political power, and that led to the rise of classical liberalism and the freedom of thought and democracy. The church now wants to embrace this and step away from its political power, but it still wants to say that there is a role in the world for both church functions and state functions. And so there's a division here between what the church is supposed to do, which is take care of social ills by training and forming men. Certainly, I think that the Pope would say women as well. And here, what he's talking about is helping to instill virtues. And that the state has its job of providing a foundation for individuals to work for their own good and the good of the common good. This brings us then to the three core principles of Catholic social thought. These are not stated by name in the document, but we can find various formulations of them in Rerum Novarum. Subsidiarity is one of the primary principles, and this is the idea that decisions should be made by the lowest authority possible for those decisions to be made, and that the larger authority, larger institution must come in to support those lower communities when necessary. So at paragraph 51, Leo XIII says that societies include smaller private societies, which are formed for the purpose of carrying out private objectives when two or three are going into partnership. And these private societies have a right to exist because they contribute to the Commonwealth and they should be protected by the public authority. One of the core principles of Catholic social thought, again, is the common good. Not defined, but there are various references to the common good in Rerum Novarum. So civil society exists for the common good and hence is concerned with the interest of all in general. That is a general formulation of the idea of the common good, that there is a common interest that we all share and that social laws should be founded upon. And finally, the third primary principle is that of solidarity, and this is the idea that we live in union with the poor and so that we support the poor. And so paragraph 37 states that when there is a question of defending the rights of individuals, the poor and badly off have a claim to a special consideration. So a command that laws and society take consideration of the poor first. And that's part of our solidarity, living with the poor. Certainly this lecture did not cover every aspect of Rerum Novarum, but we did talk about the primary takeaways from this. And the idea here is that it's an engagement with the modern world through this middle way by defending the right of property, the dignity of workers, and the relationship between church and state through these three core principles.